Hello and welcome back to A Modern Pharmacist, and in today's episode we are talking about GLP-1 pens, but not in the way that we would normally go through them in terms of the politics, how they work, side effects. It's nothing to do with that, and it's to do with how to use them safely, and that's from a prescriber's point of view. That's also from a user and a patient's point of view. So for those who are watching this thinking, is this episode for you? If you are a person who uses a GLP-1 pen, you are thinking of using one, you know a family member who does use one, or you are a health professional who is providing these on a regular basis, then this is a good episode for you because I'll be honest, after looking at a lot of the data, there was a lot of things that I wasn't aware of, and a lot of things have changed because of the amount of patients that these medications are being used in. The data is constantly evolving. So just a couple of things to go through is that my opinion on GLP-1 pens in terms of this episode, which is about how to maintain lean mass, is that the population in the next 5 to 10 years will be, and I've said this many times, will be a sarcopenic and osteoporotic mess. And what I mean by that, sarcopenia is the loss of muscle mass, and osteoporosis is the loss of bone density. And I just feel as though the way people are using these medications, it's only going to lead to that one endpoint. And I don't see any other way around this unless people are doing things such as what I will go through in this podcast. So let's get straight into it. There's no point in waiting any longer. So when we quote lean mass, I think it's always good to go through what lean mass is. And it's essentially everything that's not fat mass. So that can be muscle tissue, organs, skin, hydration, glycogen, connective tissue. So when you are losing lean mass, it doesn't mean that you are just losing muscle mass, which is what a lot of people try and lead towards because it's obviously a headline grabber, but it could mean anything other than fat mass. And the one number that sticks in my mind, and probably a lot of the public's mind, is a number that was from one of the studies called the Step 1 trial. And it said that 40% of your weight loss was lean mass. Again, we don't know whether that was purely muscle, water, and connective tissue, all the other things, but that is the number that sticks in a lot of people's mind. And that was from semaglutide, which was Ozempic, the brand name for diabetes, and Wegovy, which is the brand name for weight loss that it was licensed for. However, the newer data that's coming out, especially with tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro, shows that the lean mass that you lose whilst you are on this medication is in the region of 25%. And just so you can sort of get an overall idea of where does this lie with other interventions, when you are on a normal diet and exercise plan, that's where we would probably see most of your lean mass loss again. It would be about 25%. If you are on an intense resistance training, so going to the gym, being really optimal about how you train with high protein intake, you may reduce the lean mass to 18% of what you lose. Those who have bariatric surgery are about 18%. So when you actually put the new Mounjaro into this, it's actually not that bad in terms of what we are losing. But before I carry on, this is not me to say, if you are on the GLP-1 pen, don't worry because it's not as bad as what we once thought, because there's a lot of context that's required to apply it to whether you should be concerned about that number or not. I just thought I'd throw in a bit of data so you can see the number isn't what it used to be, but it's also still it's still not ideal. You don't want to be losing lean mass. We always go for fat mass. That's essentially what people want when we lose weight. We don't want to lose anything other than what aesthetically looks bad. And that is generally the whole idea of it. And I wanted to go through how we measure lean mass as well, just before I go into all the practicalities on how to prevent lean mass loss, because we measure it and monitor it through DEXA scans, which are low radiation, and they basically can determine whether something's fat and not fat. However, the issue is that these types of imaging don't really differentiate that well between other things and where the fat is stored. So if you have a steak, for example, and you look at it, you've got the fat around the outside, which would be the fat underneath your skin. So that's subcutaneous fat, which is fine. We can differentiate between that. But then when you have some types of steak, you'll see the marbling. So you'll see the meat with the bit of the marbling in between that. So that's intramuscular adipose tissue. Now, because these DEXA scans can't differentiate between that and other types of lean mass, when you could be losing fat from within the marbling, that could be beneficial for you because you are losing the fat between the contractile portions of the muscle, but it would be classed as a lean mass loss, which is obviously a negative thing from the objective point of view. My point is that we should be using MRIs as the gold standard, but to get everyone through an MRI is costly. It is also a bit of a pain logistically, so that's not going to happen. So a DEXA scan is what we use as the baseline. It's still good, but it's just to bear in mind that if you are losing weight, it doesn't always mean it's a bad thing. And again, it's a very, very contradicting statement to make when I'm trying to come at this from the point of view of we should be managing GLP-1 use properly. I've still got to present all the facts to you, and that's the case, is that these scans can be misleading. Now let's go on to the actual data, and I'll be honest with you, there are actually no randomized controlled trials or no evidence for adapting for protein intake and resistance training whilst on a GLP-1 pen. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people who take this, and this is from my personal experience, but also there's a lot of surveys that back this up, is that the majority of people who are taking these medications do not adapt and do not adopt a new lifestyle when they're on a GLP-1 pen. And that's because these medications are so good at losing weight that you can literally carry on doing the same things, which is no exercise, drinking alcohol, having fast foods. You can still do all them things and come out with your dream weight on the scales. So when you actually do a survey, the fact that I think it's only 38% of people are having a high enough protein intake and even less are achieving the resistance training within the gym, then you can see that this amount of lean mass that has been lost could be disproportionate, and it might not be a true representation of what could happen if we were using these medications effectively. If we did control for going to the gym a couple of times a week plus having enough protein in the diet, could that reduce the amount of lean mass that we lose from 25% down to 15% or even less, which then makes these medications even more potent in certain patient cohorts? And that's the question that a lot of these studies are going out there to try and learn. So there's two studies that are currently ongoing. So there's one called Lean Prep and there's one called Stay Lean. I think one of them is actually done by the British Medical Journal. But again, these haven't been reported yet. So all of this advice that will be coming in this podcast, or all of the anecdotes, will be from other studies where we've looked at how resistance training, how protein intake has benefited a lot of other people who are losing weight or are on a weight loss journey, not specifically using a GLP-1 pen. But I believe, based on what I've read and what I know through experience, that the mechanisms are still the same and that you could probably extrapolate a lot of this into GLP-1 users. But that's just something worthwhile that probably in the next 12 to 18 months, there'll be a lot more evidence around these patient groups. So that is something that you'll be able to advise on confidently. Now, it's probably not unusual to hear that the two main things to improve the amount of lean mass, and when we mean lean mass, we're mainly focusing on muscle because we are so focused on this idea that muscle improves your metabolic health through glucose metabolism. It also allows you to move. We always forget this. The most fundamental part of a muscle is to move the skeleton. So if you have low muscle mass or you've got low functioning muscle mass, then you're not going to be able to do basic things like get up out of a chair or go up the stairs, never mind lifting certain weights or doing certain daily activities. So a big thing is, can we preserve this going forward? And one of the main things we can do this is through, well, protein intake and resistance training. So I'm going to go through a few key points as to how you can optimize the amount of muscle mass that you have, make sure that it's functional, because that is the thing. We're obviously saying we're losing all this lean mass. If we still maintain lean mass, does that mean it's functional? So a lot of these studies don't really give you an insight into how usable that muscle is. because at the end of the day, it's okay having it, but if it doesn't perform the same actions that you want, then it's merely useless beyond the fact that it will help you with a bit of glucose metabolism. So it's always about how can we improve your quality of life and other things going forward. So I'm going to start with protein, and there's been a lot of studies on protein over the last 10 years. My perceptions changed on it over the past, well, since I was 18, so the past 13, 14 years, and how I use it. But the general consensus now is that you should be having about 1.6 grams to 2 grams per kilogram each day. I would reserve a higher amount for those who are more physically active because you are more prone to destroying and requiring more muscle mass to be built. So that's why you need more protein. But also, when you get older, you are experiencing something called anabolic resistance. And essentially, your body just doesn't want to grow to the same levels it does when you were in your mid-20s or 30s. So you need just a greater stimulus to just promote that synthesis pathway. So if you achieve the 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram each day, then there's a good chance that you will be able to maintain what you normally break down and lose through general processes in the body anyway, but also being able to add and remodel your current muscle and hopefully build a higher quality of it. But it's not that simple. So this is the thing that I will actually dedicate a podcast episode just to protein. But I've been looking into my things. I've been looking a lot more into my diabetic health. So if you are watching, you can see that I've got a continuous glucose monitor. Again, another episode I will be doing. But I've been looking at certain foods and how to optimize my diet going forward. And the biggest thing when it comes to protein is obviously having enough of the composition there. So protein as a total group is composed of 20 amino acids. So they are the building blocks of these structures. 9 of them are classed as essential because your body cannot make them. It needs to get them from elsewhere, hence why it's called essential. So in order for your body to produce good muscle, you need to have the 9 amino acids that your body cannot make present there in enough quantity. So you might have heard of something called complete proteins, which are essentially protein sources. So chicken's a really good one, eggs also a good one, where it has all of the amino acids required in enough quantities to then stimulate this process. And that is why a lot of people still go towards animal protein sources because they tend to have a complete profile, whereas plant sources tend to be deficient in certain amino acids, which is why you will need to pair them up with other things. So you might need to have, I don't know, soy with certain legumes just to have a full complement of the 9 essential amino acids plus the remaining 11. And the biggest amino acid that sticks out is called leucine. And that is probably the most powerful trigger for the synthesis of muscle within your body. And ideally, you should be trying to get, I'd say, about 2.5 to 4 grams, depending on your age and other personal factors such as exercise requirements and performance levels. And obviously, what you want to get out of it at the end of the day. You should be having that per meal and having about 3 to 4 meals a day, which if you are hitting that total protein target that I said earlier, and you are having a very, very good source of protein in each meal, then there is a very good chance that you will be hitting all of these requirements. So there's no need to do anything about that there. In terms of where should you be getting your protein from, again, always go to real food. That is what we should be eating all the time. If you cannot get protein from real food and you need to get it from supplements, that is the biggest, it's one of the hardest things that I always question every single day is what is worse, having a higher content of ultra processed food within your diet, or is it having a lack of protein? Which one's going to affect your health to the greatest? I'm swaying more to the side that if you don't have enough protein, that is more detrimental to your health. So in the case of if you need to get a protein supplement once a day, whether that be a protein shake, again, you can go for better companies where they have less ingredients, which is more of a whole food directive, then that is the way I would go because you need to build muscle. Otherwise, you will develop sarcopenia in years to come and you will lose muscle functionality. So that's protein in well, a quick overview, to be honest, without going too much in depth. The next one is resistance training. So when I say resistance training, a lot of people come back with the same answers. Does that mean resistance bands? Does that mean this? Resistance training is essentially strength training, and it's where you are loading the muscle with enough weight to force it to grow. That is essentially what it is. Now, that looks different in every different person. So, that could be body weight exercises for someone who's never trained before. That could be resistance bands. That could be low weights, or that could be extremely high weights where you're requiring 150 kilos to bench press just to stimulate that same pathway. It's all individualized to you. But the whole point of it is that you perform these exercises and you load the muscle so much that it creates like a shear stress. It then causes breakdown. It causes the need for the muscle to grow. And what what happens is essentially the body then upregulates muscle growth because it needs to counteract this idea that if it were to lift that same stimulus again, it would be able to do so. And also because there's damage there. And that is how we create functional muscle. That is also how we increase muscle mass. That is the same principle. And you need both this and protein intake to stimulate this to maximal levels. People think I'll just have protein, which is a common thing actually in the current situation of marketing, is that everything's got protein in. That must be healthy for you. If you don't have any stimulus to grow muscle other than just having protein, then you're not going to get the full effects of it, which is where you need to resistance train. Now, if you are a complete beginner, 2 times a week doing your whole body is enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis. I would say, again, 30 minutes each workout. Even if that was 10 minutes, it's still better than nothing. But twice a week, full body, which will be maybe doing some squats, doing some pull-ups. Well, you won't be doing pull-ups if you're a beginner, but you get the idea. Training the back, training the legs, chest, shoulders, big muscle groups in compound lifts. And what that means is if I were to do a bicep curl, that is isolating the bicep. Whereas if I were to do a pull up, it will include the forearms, the brachialis, it'll have the bicep, it'll have rear delts, it'll have basically the whole back. So it's recruiting a lot more muscles at once. So then that's increasing the amount of muscles that's targeted. It's more efficient for your time. You can lift more weight, all them things. So that is how I would go about resistance training, at least twice a week. If you are able to do more, then that is optimal. Like again, I do 4 to 5 resistance training sessions per week, along with a lot of other cardio. But that is actually a good point I want to say. Resistance training isn't cardio, which a lot of people all get mixed up. They'll go to the gym saying, I need to go to the gym twice a week, and they'll do a class. Now, don't get me wrong, that is still beneficial for your health. But from a muscle growth point of view, I always say this to people who do classes, the way in which you perform an exercise in a HIIT class or any other aerobic class is so quick that it is not conducive for muscle growth. So you need to do a targeted, not bodybuilding session, but along them lines, because that is what's going to maximize muscle growth and strength. Then you need to do all the other things to make sure that it's still functional, being able to maneuver your body in certain ways and not just on a machine. If you are wondering how much you should be doing in terms of exercise, in terms of how many reps, so if you were to do pull-ups, how many pull-ups should you do? Let's say on a good day, you could do 10, and that is pushing your body to the absolute maximum. You would then aim for 8 reps in a set. And that is because you should leave about 1 to 2 reps in reserve, meaning if you really needed to, and there was a gun to your head to do more reps, that you should only be able to do 1 to 2 more. And that is probably the sweet spot, because if you go too much over your, how would you put it? If you become too fatigued and you're training yourself to failure every single time, then you're going to reduce the recovery rate. You are going to increase the chance of injury. So that's not obviously conducive if you want to improve your metabolic health going forward. So they're the 2 main things that are going to improve muscle mass. But before I finish this episode, I want to go on to another section of lean mass that a lot of people miss, which is your bone health. And like I said before, lean mass is anything other than fat. And muscle mass is one thing that really goes down, and we need a lot of it and for it to remain functional, but also bone mass. And a lot of people naturally decline in their bone mass as they get older. It is also disproportionate. So a lot more women, I think it's 5 times the rate at which men experience osteoporosis. Now, just a quick little overview. Once you do a scan on your bone mineral density, that is like the composition of your bone. If you are then deficient slightly in your bone mineral density, so let's say the average healthy bone is, again, these are arbitrary numbers, is 100%. If your bone is then only 80%, you will then be classed as something called osteopenic, which means that you've got some bone loss, but it's not all the way there. And then let's say in another person it's 60%, that is classed as osteoporosis, meaning that there's a lot less bone mass than what there should be. And I think the best way to think of it is if you have like a normal sponge and then, well, actually, if you have a block of cheese, I don't know, like a red Leicester, I'm not the best with cheese. It's a solid block, which would be normal bone. And then as soon as you start going to like Swiss cheese and it's got holes in, that is when you become osteopenic, and osteoporotic is when you obviously have a lack of density within that bone, which, as you can probably assume, is not good for your health because bones are what support your whole skeletal system. Without good bone density, you will have constant fractures. You won't be able to stand upright. There'll be so many defects that can happen if you have a low bone density. And people are aware that women, when they go through the menopause, they have lower estrogen. Well, it goes to zero basically, or near enough. And then they are not remodeling bone. So they are not producing the same amount of bone that they should be when they were premenopausal. And like I said before, I've got a stat here. So over 50 years old, 4.4% of men will experience osteoporosis, whereas 19.6% of women will do so in the same cohort. So again, nearly a five-fold increase just based on gender alone. And this is naturally, obviously women will hopefully take HRT, which was scaremongered years ago. It's not for this podcast, but I would advise you to look into it because it is definitely beneficial. And when you are then adding in this idea that people aren't exercising, they are not eating the right amount of food or having a balanced diet, that bone loss is going to be accelerated even more. Now, bearing in mind that 5 times the rate for women for bone loss, I actually probably didn't say that in the best way, but women are more predisposed to bone loss anyway because of the menopause. And then from my experience, there are probably at least 5 to 10 times more women on the weight loss pen. And when you add that into a postmenopausal woman anyway, which is the common age group that I see, I would say the average person probably being about mid-50s, late 40s, give or take. And this data was actually from a trial called the SELECT trial, where they got semaglutide, which is Ozempic, Wegovy, and they compared it to placebo. And the rate of hip fractures was 1% for the GLP-1 group versus 0.2% for the placebo, which is a 5 times increase for the GLP-1 group. And then it went up to 2.4% for GLP-1 versus 0.6% in adults over 75. So this is before you go into the menopause. This is just genetically anyway. If you then add the GLP-1 into postmenopausal women, you can see the amount of bone loss that can be happening, especially when these people are not training and eating to the right levels anyway. Other points that I want to put into context: if you were to have bariatric surgery, you have a 21 to 44% increased fracture risk again. And both of these share the same mechanism. It's that when you are losing weight rapidly, you are not putting enough stress on the bone. And this mechanism always seems counterintuitive to a lot of people, that your bone requires stress and weight to grow. When you would think, actually, I don't want to damage my bone, so I'd want to take the weight off it. And that's what a lot of people think. But when you put stress and shear pressure onto a bone, it then causes a remodeling process. So it removes some bone and then strengthens it up. And that is what comes out with really good bone mineral densities. Also, alongside that, you need to make sure that you are having enough vitamin D and calcium within your diet, which in people who are on GLP-1 medication and bariatric surgery are not eating enough anyway. And when you also couple the fact that both of these mechanisms are reducing the amount of absorption from your diet, you can see why a lot of people can really have really bad bone mineral density in the next 5 to 10 years. And that is why I always say about this risk of osteoporosis. So there's no good in me saying all these risks. How would you go about managing someone who's going through a GLP-1 pen, or if you're taking one yourself? You need to make sure that you are having enough vitamin D within your diet, especially within countries such as the UK where we're not getting enough sunlight. So years ago, it was 400 to 800 units each day. and this is something I need to look into more, but the guidance is slowly shifting towards 1,500 units to 2,000 units a day just for maintenance of normal levels. And if you've ever had a vitamin D level, we would, in the NHS anyway, we would say a level of greater than 50 is good enough. When in reality, I would be saying north of 75 is a minimum. I would be saying 100 is where we should be aiming for, which you can see why a lot of people have potentially a lot of poor bone health when it comes to the UK, and why we see so many people on multiple types of medication, such as bisphosphonates, where a lot of it could be prevented through a lot of easy lifestyle advice, which is easy to find, let's be honest. But that's what I wanted to go through with regards to bone health. Again, there's no direct study in terms of if people were controlled with protein intake, resistance training. This select trial was just basically GLP-1 versus placebo. So there's a lot of things that, does this apply to me if I'm leading a very healthy lifestyle? Probably not. But again, only over the next few years will we find out whether these studies are compatible to certain patient groups. Now, the thing with, there's more peptides, more GLP-1s upcoming, retatrutide being the one that sticks into people's minds. And I think it will gain approval probably in the next 12 months by the way it's looking. But until that comes out and there's more categoric data on it, I'm not going to discuss it in terms of what I would advise, because I know people are using it for research use only. Again, I don't really see the point in just using something if you don't have any meaningful data. But that's just me. I wouldn't put anything into my body, and I wouldn't advise it for anyone else. But the whole point of this podcast is that actually the data is changing, and the data has changed. Lean mass loss isn't as bad as we once thought, and lean mass isn't just muscle mass. We should really be having a facility where we can measure the amount of contractile tissue in the muscle that is being lost during these procedures, which would then give us a greater insight into whether certain interventions are detrimental for your health or not. Needless to say, because this value is lower than what we once thought, it doesn't mean I advocate for the use of these. And if you are using them, you should be using them properly. So you should be having a high protein diet. You should be resistance training. You should be adapting your diet to your new metabolic set points, because when you do stop this, it's no question. I've said it for years. I wish I would have recorded it, that a lot of these people are just going to regain the weight at accelerated rates because they've gone from a new metabolic set point whilst maintaining basically everything that they're doing before. So there's no doubt that they are going to return to that point. So use them properly if you need to. The other question is, do we need them in the first place if you are not diabetic? And even if you are diabetic, this is another thing. Do we need to be there in the first place? Because a lot of type 2 diabetes, for where it's used, is largely reversible in the first place. I would probably argue 90%. And just a sort of closing thought or thing to ponder on is that there is a new class of medication being trialed to prevent muscle mass loss during the use of GLP-1 pens, which is such a lucrative area because, like I said, I don't feel like these should be used in the amount that they are. And then we're given a medication to solve a problem that probably shouldn't exist in the first place. But that is the modern world for you. And this was the Modern Pharmacist podcast. What a way to end it. As always, this podcast is and was for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. If you do want to go and see a professional, by all means do so. But I would always advise to do a bit of research before you go and see them. Hopefully you gained something from this podcast. Any comments, leave them below. And I appreciate anyone for listening or watching, and I will see you in the next episode.